So before I begin my talk, I am from the South, so we have to give preambles. So let me trace my genealogy because that is what a lot of middle class do who are middle aged. So my genealogy, um, I am connected to Fitzhugh Brundage. He does not know this. I used to teach at Ole Miss for 5 years, and I'm a Southerner with roots dating back to South Carolina when it was still a colony. And so that curried me a lot of favor in Mississippi because people were heavily invested in their Southern identity. And even though I am a historian of slavery and medicine and women's history, I had always been very, very interested in memory and also public history. And so I literally created a course based on your work. I know you didn't know that. And my students actually enjoyed it. And so, you know, it won't be much. It was Mississippi. So, oh, okay, great. And then Catherine Clinton literally mentors my mentor. And when she found out that Jim Downs was a dear colleague of mine and a mentor, she literally pulled me into her orbit. And so I get these calls and lovely handwritten letters and notes. And so she's like, so what are you doing so-and-so date? And I already know I have to say yes. Yes, I will see you in Belfast, Ireland. Yes, I will see you in Louisville, Kentucky. And so here I am. And the other part of this is my own personal connection to entering into a space where I really don't have formal training, and yet I've had to train myself kind of on the fly. And I share it with Catherine. I went to a junior high school in Washington, D.C. before my family moved back to South Carolina. And this is before the movie Glory. It was, at that time, Washington, D.C. was known as the original chocolate city. And now we call it chocolate with a vanilla swirl because literally 3 years ago was the first time that Washington, D.C. Was not predominantly African American in terms of its population. And so I went to Shaw Junior High School. Didn't think anything about it until years later I found out it was named for Robert Gould Shaw of, the 54th and that fame. And so there are these ways that I have been pulled into talking about Civil War memory, in particular my 5 years at Ole Miss, but also now having a book come out literally 3 weeks ago and being pulled again into the public history and memory debate around James Marion Sims. And so for those of you who don't know, James Marion Sims is was a South Carolinian, and he is most commonly known as the father of American gynecology. And about every 8 years or so, starting from the late 90s until today, there tends to be a lot of controversy around Sims's early work on his experimental work on enslaved women and later poor Irish immigrant women. So here's James Marion Sims in all of his glory after he achieved fame in the United States and also Europe for curing vesico-vaginal fistula. And essentially what that was, a very common ailment that affected women who had very protracted, very long labors. And so what happened when these women are in labor for 2-3 days, there's a lack of oxygen. And so there's an injury that kind of crushes the pelvic, and the child is stuck. And so there's sloughing in the upper vaginal region, which creates a fistula or a hole, and the bladder is exposed. The end result is incontinence. If there is ripping also in the anus, there's incontinence there as well. So although it was not a deadly condition, you can imagine people are ostracized because of the stench. Women get all kinds of infections. If you are an enslaved woman of childbearing age, your economic value drops. And so it becomes a real problem for not only those women personally, but also the men who owned them. So Sims enters the scene not being trained as a gynecologist. Gynecology didn't really exist as a field, as a professional branch of medicine in the 1840s when he began his experimental trials on enslaved women. So Sims had treated a white woman who fell off of a horse, Mrs. Merritt. And in his examination of Mrs. Merritt, he discovered a way to examine her cervix. And literally, he writes in his memoir, A Story of My Life, he says, the idea came to him from medical school that if there's enough air pressure applied, that the cervix could be opened. And so he was treating an enslaved woman, Lucy, who had been sent to him by her owner because she had vesicovaginal fistula, or nowadays we call it obstetrical fistula, and he wasn't able to cure her. But after Mrs. Merrill, he thought, you know what, let me speak with her owner, Mr. Zimmerman, and I'll keep Lucy. And as he writes, he ransacks the county for enough cases, so Anarcha and Betsy are the only enslaved experimental patients where we know their names, Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and about 6 others, and their children. So from 1844 through 1849, he attempts to repair the surgeries on these women. What happens though, after about 2.5 years, he loses the support of the white community because he has 2 surgical assistants. Nathan Bozeman is one of them. And surgeries are quite rare. I mean, they're community events. And so he has this slave hospital built. The community comes in to see him repair these women. They're literally public events. And so after 2 years of failed experimental trials, his assistants leave him, and so does the community. So what does Sims do? And this is kind of the center of the controversy. He trains his slave patients to assist him as surgical assistants and nurses. And people are outraged in the 21st century, and I think today, I always say to them, what do you think slaves did? They worked. And so the other controversy is, after he cures these women and sends them back, because he also leases these slaves, so he has a contractual obligation to the slave owners of these women and their children that he cannot harm them, right? A contractual obligation, or he can face legal action and repercussions. And so after 5 years, they are cured of this condition. Sims later writes an article a few years later about this. By 1855, he has moved on to New York and opens up the New York State Hospital for Women. So this is the context for Sims and his work, right? After his death, his colleagues talk about his courageous work. They mention the humble Negro servitors, the courageous Negro servitors. Sims makes no bones about the fact that he experimented on enslaved women. This was par for the course in the 19th century. Most doctors experimented on vulnerable populations. So in the North, they're going to experiment on the poor, prisoners, those who are in lunatic asylums. In the South, generally what this means is they are experimenting on enslaved people. Sims was not exceptional in that regard. He is literally carrying on a medical tradition and practice that describes the culture of Southern medicine during the time. So after his death, Sims' statue is erected in Bryant Park. It's later moved in the early 20th century to Central Park and sits across from the New York Academy of Medicine, where Sims was a very prominent member, and Sims was also a former president of the American Medical Association. Now, this is how I was brought into it again. You know, I'm like, I just want to center the women. And all of a sudden, I'm getting these emails and calls and texts. What do you think? What do you think? And I'm like, what's going on? So I found out that the Black Youth Project is staging a protest of the Sims statue in Central Park. They want it removed. They are not the first groups the first group to make this demand, right? Remember, I told you, at least ever since I started to study Sims, this has been ongoing since the late 90s, about every 8 to 10 years. And so, you know, it's, I don't know if there are children here, so I will watch my language. F, white supremacy, where 103rd Street and 5th Avenue, right, in Central Park, Saturday, August 9th, 1 through 3. And they do it for the mothers of gynecology in memory of Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and 11 other unnamed women. And they're really including also those children, the mothers of modern gynecology. And I remember my book title was not, as Catherine can tell you, it was not medical bondage. It was originally the mothers of gynecology. And I had a huge row with my editors because they said it was giving too much agency to these women. And so I had to remind them from 1846 to 1849, when Sims's surgical assistants left him, these women knew more about gynecological surgery on obstetrical fistula repair than anybody else in the country, because they were literally learning it at the hands of this man who would later be known as the father of American gynecology. And so this is not me giving agency, this is me actually giving them the credit for helping Sims do the work that cured their bodies, right? I didn't win that fight. So it's medical bondage. And so these young women who are part of the BYP 100 are not simply doing this for hyperbole, right? But what they're doing is inserting a historical fact that has been effaced from the historical record in memory. All right, so here's the protest, right? This is the picture that really put the Sims controversy and protest over his statue removal at the forefront. I cannot tell you how many requests I got for newspapers. It's interesting not to be on TV. I was asked to be on TV for MSNBC, Al Jazeera, PBS, all of these places because of Charlottesville. And so that's not what I do. And yet, because I'm the only person, my joke has always been, if you look in the history departments of any place I work, I'm always the only person who looks like me. And so I understand why they're also asking me for my opinion about a thing that I don't necessarily do. And so, I'm asked, right, by newspaper journalists in particular, not to provide historicization or context or even nuance about Sims and this whole moment in American history. What I'm asked is, should the statue stay or should it be removed, right? And so I never give them that answer because I think it does a disservice to us actually being precise and accurate in the ways that history needs to be taught. So this is the East Harlem Preservation Organization has actually been trying to remove the statue since around almost about a decade or so. And they had a large meeting, probably a year and a half before the August 2017 protests. So these are the organizers, Diane Collier and Marina Ortiz, right? And they, living in East Harlem, this is a part of Harlem that has not been gentrified yet. And so many of the residents look like Collier and Ortiz. And so for them, they find it objectionable that they have to pass by this man who used these women's bodies in exploitative ways, right? And so, once again, here we are confronted with the ways that this issue has been presented, particularly within the media. This was an article that I was a part of. They talked to a number of Sims historians, those people who are also critics, and those folk who feel that Sims needed to be protected and rescued from attack. And so the article in the South Carolina Post and Courier was entitled "Savior of Women or Medical Monster: The Fraught Legacy of South Carolina's Most Infamous Physician by Lawrence Saucer. And so this is where I always call for not even a revisionist history, but actually providing what I call some clarity and some nuance around this issue, right? People are never really quite either or. And so what I have to do is paint the landscape of antebellum America, particularly the antebellum South. This was a man who was born in South Carolina. He does this pioneering gynecological work in the frontier. At that time, it's Mount Meigs, Alabama, about 15 miles outside of Montgomery. And he is a slave owner. He writes objectionable things about Black people. He writes objectionable and distasteful things about women. Right? In his autobiography, he says he cannot think of anything more distasteful than looking at a woman's body. Right? And yet, here he is known as the father of American gynecology. And yet, this whole notion of Sims as a butcher, right, wanting to mangle the bodies of enslaved women, it would go against the very foundation of slavery to want to butcher the bodies of fecund, fertile, reproductive women who were meant to breed. The existence of slavery in the United States always stood in the center of Black women's wombs. Literally, that is how the system is perpetuated since 1807, when the Constitution bans the illegal importation of Africans, right? So a domestic slave trade flourishes in this country, and it is really based off of the reproduction of Black babies to slave owners. And so he is also obligated by these contracts, right? Because these are leased women. And so he has a contractual obligation to take care of them financially and also medically. Now, does that mean that Sims loved them like some white great father? No, he made them work, right? They were the ones tending to the gardens, watching his children, cooking food, helping him in the slave hospital. They were the ones doing the work because they were still enslaved, right? But it would not have been in his best interest to not repair their conditions. And this is why he continues doing this until 1849. So the kind of gender discontent that happens, which I think is really interesting and exceptional, and it's this, it's very different than what we find with those who have been very vocal about the statue removals in the South, right? So here you have a Southern symbol, right, represented by James Marion Sims, sitting in the center of Manhattan in Central Park, and it allows for literally a kind of pivoting of those who become the leaders in this movement. So in the South, what you've seen, and I think Charlottesville, another place where I lived, I did a postdoc at UVA, Charlottesville was interesting because white men literally take they take the mantle. They are the spokespersons, the mouthpieces for the preservation and maintenance of those Confederate symbols. But in New York, it's largely Black women, right, who are leading protests. And they're having support, especially by Latino or Latinx women as well. And they are the ones who are behind the petitions and the calls to remove Sims' statue by the New York City Parks Commission. White men have largely been absent from this debate. Largely. There have been a few white women who are historians who have written some op-eds in professional newsletters and on historian websites and blogs, but for the most part, this is something that really deals with the politics of Black people's rage and white people's indifference, right? And so that's what marks it to me as exceptional from the kinds of debates that are raging on in the South and in the Deep South. And why are people enraged, right? Why does there seem to be this kind of white indifference in New York around Sims's statue? A large part of it is because the framing of blackness, right, has literally been one where black women have been erased. And this goes back to medical journals, right? This is where educated lay people and also medical doctors, students are getting their information in the 19th century about these kinds of conditions that afflict their slaves. And so this is an illustration of Sims and his nurse who are repairing a patient. Now remember, I told you, Sims was a very prolific medical writer. He had written about 7 or 8 articles before he published on vesicovaginal fistula in 1852. So he mentioned, right, these enslaved women, and yet here you literally have the whitening of the experimental patient in the pages of medical texts, right? So you're looking at it, and here is a nurse who has her hands resting on the buttocks of the white patient, who really is a slave patient. The woman is clothed. It is a room that only contains the nurse and Sims. The nurse is the one inserting the speculum into the patient's vaginal opening. Sims literally has his hand rested gently on the thigh of the patient. And had I not put in quotation marks slave, you would not have known, right, that this was supposed to be an enslaved patient. So what we do know from the article and from Sims's memoir is that when these women underwent patients, it was a public event, right? It literally was a public spectacle. And yet you have the visual erasure of blackness from medical text. Although gynecology, and I argue the first women's hospital, right, being founded in Mount Meigs, Alabama, is done on black enslaved women. Right? Later, Nathan Bozeman, he is was one of Sims's proteges, but also one of the surgical assistants that left because Sims had a number of failures. He starts work after 1855. Sims sells him the slave hospital after he moves to New York. And one of my dear colleagues, Nicole Ivey, who's also a Sims scholar and a historian of medicine, has written about this in just very eloquently and has made some really incisive comments. But she talks about Nathan Bozeman's slave patient, Matilda Stamper, right? This is also a woodcut illustration found in a medical journal article. Once again, right? Matilda Stamper was an enslaved woman who Nathan Bozeman worked on in Alabama, and yet here is Matilda Stamper whitened. She is pictured alone. She is naked, right? And there is an erasure of black women. On a more personal note, I was speaking with my mother yesterday as I was flying into Louisville, and she called me as I was eating. My mother is a retired science teacher. She has a college degree in professional biology, and to kick up the science geek status that she has, she also, when she worked at Georgetown University Hospital, has a professional certificate in medical terminology. And so she calls me, I finished your book. You know, as mothers do, it's great, you should win a Pulitzer, you're the best, right? She does all those things that, you know, that my colleagues don't do. And so she says to me, though, that, you know, I didn't know this. My mother is an educated woman, right? She reads voraciously. She has a background in biology and science and has worked at a hospital, has taken classes when she was in graduate school, and yet she never knew black women were experimented on. And she certainly didn't know enslaved women were experimented on, right? And so how could she have known when even the texts, right, that were to be real life examples of what was going on in this pivotal moment in American modern gynecology, right? how could she have known black women were being treated when they have literally been whitened in these pages? And yet, the slur that is used against historians like me and my colleagues are that we are the revisionist historians. Okay. So this is it. The last slide, see? Framing Blackness, right? This is a very popular picture. Marie Jenkins Schwartz has this on her book. And it's from a series, the History of Medicine series by Robert Tom, 1952. So black women have been blackened, and yet here you have this room where privacy is given. Sims and the enslaved women, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, look as if there is some trepidation. Anarcha looks as if she's clutching her chest in modesty. The other enslaved women are allowed to peer behind the white curtain, while the two medical assistants are also, gazing and pondering what to do. She is clothed, she isn't naked. And so by 1952, you could insert black women in, but you could insert them with a kind of politics of respectability that enslaved women could not use, and that white Southern men like Sims and Bozeman would not give them because of the racial etiquette and practice of the day. And so once again, what do we do with these kinds of fraught, contested histories, right? When even the historical records have erased black women or either rendered them as fictions. And so I will stop there. I thank you for your time and patience. And I look forward to your questions.